John O'Brien here today, shooting a seminar called Why I Formulate the Blends the Way I Do. And so many of you guys know my background, which started in the Land Stewardship Project back in 1991. My research career started a couple years later in regard to the first Discovery Farm program, and my contribution being measuring the paddocks, the areas that the cattle were going to be entering the next day. I was scissors cutting 6 inches from the ground, forage sampling those forages, analyzing for protein, energy, minerals, and creating a baseline effect, doing it in each paddock 6 different times. During the year, I forgot the amount of paddocks. There's probably about 20 different paddocks, so there's a big volume of forage sampling, and that's where my career started with that research. But right from the get-go, I've been collecting numerous forage samples from my client base, about 170,000 samples, and that has told me a lot, which has contributed to what I'm doing with the formulation. So shortly thereafter, I started a seed buying group where I was selling oats, peas, buckwheat, rye, you name it, clovers, alfalfas, straight ingredients, pasture mixes, cover crop blends, etc. And so in theory, many of the blends I sell for wildlife are all based on a cover crop mentality. Integrated weed management, maximum nutrition, maximum growth. So many people forget that the concepts that contribute to maximum growth also contribute to maximum quality, and also contribute to, in a lot of cases, if you're talking about building soil, regenerative health, regenerative food plotting, and all that, they all intertwine, they all overlap. There's a synergistic effect. What I learned early on in my career is you always want, my focus at that time was manage intensive grazing, with the mentality coming from the New Zealanders who were experts. Many of them only had 40 acres, maybe 80 acres, trying to stockpile as much feed or create as much feed throughout the year as possible. As an end goal on the cattle side, averaging about 1,000 to 1,200 pound animals, trying to have 1 acre per animal. And in the United States, that hasn't really been or wasn't really what was able to be achievable, partly because the body size production comes into play. But trying to maximize that sward, that block of area of land that you're planting. So with that in mind, to maximize this, I've known from the start that you have to naturally get that seed out of the ground by good agronomic practices, pre-plant, at planting, and post-plant. And then with that in mind, we also wanted to plant the right forages at the right places at the right times. And I've said this numerous times, what I learned from people back in that era is, well, before you pull on a property, look at what's in the ditches. And it confuses people. And that doesn't mean that you want to plant all the same things that you saw in the ditch, but the ditch or the non-areas that are growing will teach you so much. Maybe they become cornfields, bean fields. Maybe they were existing pasture areas, oat fields, winter wheat fields, alternative crops, cash crops. So, because what's just off that area that you're planting was there growing successful and has stayed successful over a period of time. Could it be a year? Yes. Could it be multiple years? Sure. Could it be decades? Yes. So when I get on properties over my career, I've always had that mindset. So again, also part of what I've done with Grand Prairie Outdoors is you have to appeal to people from Maine to Florida to Texas to Idaho. And again, that's what the genetics that we brought over way back 30 years ago from New Zealand. That New Zealand genetics, which a lot of that focus at that time was brassicas. Everybody was planting turnips, for example. And again, first thing ever planted, second forage ever planted for food plotting was Puna chicory. And again, there's a lot better varieties of chicory. And as people will hear me say, I don't love turnips. There's tons of better alternatives to turnips. Turnips have their goal. Every forage has a place on your property. Every forage has a why. And so that's also something to consider. So when you're formulating, we know that Mother Nature has way more extremes than what it ever did back in the 90s, early 2000s. The rains can be heavier, the droughts can be more prolonged, the wet periods of time and the rains can be way heavier. We've seen numerous flooding episodes on my research properties in the last 7-8 years. Some periods of drought, prolonged drought, the seasons have seemed to shift. So the mindset is always like, well, you need to plant to better handle Mother Nature. Do we know if it's going to be a wet year? Do we know if it's going to be a dry year? Could we have a wet year that becomes a dry year? Could we have a dry year that becomes a wet year? Could we have a year that starts out cool but then becomes prolonged hot? So we can't predict the future, but we can help manage what Mother Nature throws at us. And that's what this whole program is about. The GRO program is about planting biodiverse forages. That's what we always did with pastures. Because when we wanted to graze these animals, April, June, August, October, some of those forages that are best in April are not as good in June and July, right? Some of these forages handle hot and dry. Some of these forages are more cool season and handle those cool climates. So again, if you want to, whether you're planting a perennial clover blend, whether you're planting a warm season annual blend, whether you're planting a fall focus blend, the mindset needs to be planting diversity to handle whatever what other Mother Nature throws at us. So, and also we want to plant the now to benefit the future, and that's what cover crops do. When people come to me even right now, they're like, "Well, I want to plant a cover crop blend. I just took off winter wheat. What should I do?" First question is, what are you going to plant next year? Very few food plotters think about what do they plant next year. And I always talk about having a 3-year rotation because what you plant next year affects the following year. But even for some of you guys, we just want to have a start. What are we going to do next year? Is that going to be corn? Is that going to be beans? Is that going to be a perennial blend? Is that going to be just a cover crop? What type of cover crop? The next question is usually, what is your predominant weeds? Is it a diverse segment of weeds that are both grass and the broadleafs? And again, that can make things more challenging. If they're mainly grass-focused weeds, then we want to plant more of a broadleaf, legume focus. If your weeds are more broadleafs, then of course we could start with more of a grain or a pure grain blend, so we could help manage those weeds. And again, no matter what we're doing, the whole mindset is having as dense a stand as possible, because that naturally keeps weeds at bay. Open canopies attract weeds. Closed canopies reduce weeds. The other part of the equation with my formulations. And I always challenge people to look at tags and see when you plant what's on that bag, does it result, if everything is done right, ideal growing conditions, planting practices, right place, right time, right weight, right rate, weight, pounds, rate, volume, will that result in a thick enough stand, 100% or above stand? And a lot of times nowadays that's not. So that's the first thing we want to do is formulate forages. Let's just say our goal is to have 5 different forages. Well, what are those forages? Do you have sand ground? Do you have peat ground? Do you have hard clay ground? And so we start with that. And then location can be more of an issue if you're planting the old genetic turnips, just dwarf grapes, radishes, because of their windows being tighter and they're not as apt to handle the weather and diseases and things like that. So there's a lot of new forages. When you're coming up with a lot of these new forages, that gives you a lot more choices of what to plant, okay? So many people don't know. They might even reach out to me and say, hey, I want to plant these 5 forages. What should I do? Well, what's your end goal? Let's just say if we start with 5 forages, what percentage do you want those to be standing, growing, actively growing in the end? Let's just say if you had turnips, radish, rape, for example. I don't like rape, but let's just go with that. And then let's just go with, you put in there winter wheat and winter rye, right? First, we want to have you guys tell me, what is the blend for percentage at the end? And let's just say, well, I want equal amounts of each, 20% of each. Okay, well, so what is the full seeding rate of rape? What's the full seeding rate of turnips? What's the full seeding rate of radishes? Okay, so if we want to find a stand of 20%, so we want 2 pounds of radishes, we want 2 pounds of rape, because their full rates are 10 pounds an acre. And then on the turnips, the full rate is more like 6 pounds an acre. So if you want 20% of the, of that final stand to be turnips, then you're going to want to be about 1.2 pounds of turnips in that blend, right? So, and that'll give you 20% of the final stand. Full rates of winter wheat is 100 pounds an acre. Full rates of winter rye is 100 pounds an acre, which would mean 20% of a full rate would be 20 pounds. So your blend that you would formulate would be 20 pounds of wheat, 20 pounds of rye, 1.2 pounds of turnips, 2 pounds of radishes, 2 pounds of rape, and that would give you a full 100% of a full stand. Might you want to make a slight adjustment in your seeding rates there if you have less than ideal planting expertise, conditions, things like that? Sure. Some people ask, well, can you plant too much? Well, if you're trying to accomplish, what are you trying to accomplish with this blend? That's what I always ask people early on too. What are you really trying to accomplish? Do you really want a lot of winter bulbs with the turnips? Do you want to have a lot of loosening of the soil, bio-drilling from the radishes? Are you trying to give attraction? And again, those 5 forages are not the most attractive, across the longer period of time in the fall. So what are you really trying to accomplish? So, and let's just go another example. Let's just say I want a perennial blend, a perennial clover heavy blend. The first thing I might ask is, well, are you sure you don't want some alfalfa? Everybody that knows me knows I love alfalfa, but if you're one of those guys, you're telling me, no, I don't want alfalfa. Next question is this shady? How shady? And again, that is part of the equation. So again, when it comes to perennial blends, let's just say if you're taking alfalfa out of the equation, you got ladino clover, which is the base of most perennial clover blends. Maybe you got some medium red clover, maybe you got a little L-site clover, and then maybe you got a couple annual clovers there. When we formulate that, again, we want to formulate it on what percentage of ladino you want to have at the end. Same way with each of these other species. What is your full rate? And then you can back figure how much you want to put per acre, And so again, why would you want to formulate at less than 100%? So many wildlife companies are selling blends as low as 50% of a full stand. And I say to people that know me really well, I think there's 2 options. Either people are not aware, educated, because they don't do this for a living, and they don't know what they don't know, and they don't know that they're not providing enough seed. Or the other alternatives, yes, they know that so many food plotters are spitting way more seed than recommended, and so they are actually looking at profitability. Yes, I'll put less in a bag. The end user, you, are going to seed heavier, and the stands are going to look thick enough. And maybe those stands aren't perfect anyway, but again, if you reach out to your supplier and say, hey, my success is not what I want it to be, it tends to be not that supplier, but your issue, the end user. Maybe you didn't plant right. You planted too deep, not deep enough. We didn't have enough rain. It's on you. Well, it's on you who's watching this now to even back check, even if it's me. Am I selling you the goods, or am I selling you a bill of goods? Okay, so for formulating, for me, I always want something that explodes out of the ground. In the farming world, those are typically called nurse crops or companion crops. When guys were establishing just straight alfalfa, for example, many farmers are adding oats at 1.5 to 3 bushel per acre, depending on if you're gonna just graze this which most of the time you're not just grazing straight off of. If you're going to be baling this, if you're going to be chopping it, use too much of a nurse crop, companion crop can act as a smothering effect and reduce the establishment of that legume. Not enough, you could also have some weeds that creep in, which is one of the biggest reasons for having these nurse crops and companion crops, is to naturally explode out of the ground, create a canopy, reducing weed establishment and pressures. So typically you're seeing around that 50 pounds an acre of like oats, peas and oats, as a nurse crop. But then what we used to do in the grazing world too, for those that didn't want to have a grain as a companion crop, they just want to have something established. And again, this is something I see some other companies scoff at, but they don't know what they don't know because they haven't lived in this world of the grazing community, of the forage world. There is some forages that just explode. They grow quicker, and there's growth habits there. So some of these annual clovers grow way faster than these slower growing perennial clovers. The basic concept is what lasts the longest takes the longest to establish. Why is that? Because it's making roots. You're not seeing what's going on below the ground. That's what's happening first. And then eventually what's above ground really starts exploding and growth. So a lot of annual clovers, because they're not building the extensive root system, cases like your alfalfas, your chicories, medium red clovers, that they grow a little bit faster and they create a canopy effect. The other part of the equation is we don't want, in the grazing world, we generally want to keep cattle, goats, other ruminants, horses, you name it, off these forages, these pastures, these paddocks, as long as we can, because we want those roots to be building up energy for their survivability. And so we want these animals, if they're using oats, for example, peas and oats, those are sacrifice crops. They're growing quicker. They're more desirable early on. Those animals will consume those, not as apt to eat those slower growing that are down lower, because we don't want that. Just like clipping. When we always say, clip half, leave half, or never clip below 6 inches from the ground. It's the same concept that these forages are just growing. If you just planted straight ladino clover with some medium red clover and alsike in your food plot, those deer, if they're attacking that forage that's under 6 inches tall, it's slowing the recovery time, the snap back. And when you have that going on, you're also challenging yourself with potential weed issues that we usually see week 3 through 5 thereafter. So that's usually part of my formulation on some of my products like Inner Sanctum, Elite, Clover Craze. There's usually something in these forages that's growing as fast as can be. On another side of our plantings, this fall focus, even though we don't always use companion crops like, I do in one of my regenerative blends where I use winter wheat, winter rye, winter triticale, some peas and buckwheat, and then the brassicas. I do have that concept where we got some sacrifice crops, nurse crops in there. But on the pure brassica blends, for example, we have forages that, like radishes, that grow the fastest. And then once they get closer to bolting out, heading out, seeding out, their palatability really drops. And at that time, when we get closer to that day 35 to 42, some of these other brassicas that have a little bit slower maturities, maybe mature in 80, 90 days, they're really exploding there. And so then the deer tend to turn off some on those radishes, and then they move on to the other forages that are really drawing in more sugars, becoming more palatable, naturally higher bricks, and that they're still in the early to mid vegetative stage. So that's one of the things that so many people that rely so much on turnips and radish, they don't think about that the radishes are maturing at 42 and maybe as long as 56 days. But as we move farther south, the warmer weathers, they mature quicker. Turnips will mature in 60 days. And once you get there out about 60 days, they really plunge on attraction, palatability. Yes, you might have some bulbs that are a possible benefit, with nutrient sequestering, naturally loosening the soil, stockpile the energy sources for winter in some cases. Those become the benefits there. So what brassicas will tolerate what? Most of this old genetics, not so well. New genetics, better, because they have better insect resistance, better plant disease resistance. And when you have a wet year on brassicas, a big issue tends to be diseases, right? Some cases when you have wet and really hot, insects are attracted to forages that are diseased or unhealthy or stressed. When you keep your forages actively growing high in sugars, it's a natural protectant. And I won't go into those reasons now on the why that works. But again, that's why these newer genetics out there, they handle the environments, the weather challenges way better than your dwarf Essic rapes and turnips and that. So when we formulate, we want to have forages that are growing and maturing in for fall focus 42 to 60 days. Then we want to have a block of forages that mature in that 60 to 80 days. And if there's any forages that mature over 80 days, that's even a side benefit. Some of those forages mature in 90 to 100 days. That doesn't mean they grow way slower, but just means they take way longer before they bolt or head out or seed out and reach full maturity. Same concepts with the annual clovers. Same concepts with perennial clovers, alfalfas. Everything has a average maturity date. That date can be affected by the weather and Mother Nature. So again, when you're trained, no matter what plot you're trained to formulate, the mindset is always, something that could tolerate hot, something that could tolerate cool, something that grows really fast. That's a must no matter what for integrated weed management, and also reducing early grazing pressures on those slower developing forages. And then we want to have something that can tolerate wet and something that can tolerate cool. So there's some forages that can actually tolerate each of those situations pretty well. Some forages don't like wet feet. Some forages, especially if we're talking warm season annual blends, they need a lot of heat and they don't like a lot of moisture. They need some, of course, to develop, but they could get by with it, actually like a lower amount of precipitation, but they really need those heat units. Corn being one of those, for example, and of course there's more and more corn developed that have artesian type qualities, meaning that they don't need as much moisture there to persist and to end up being what your end goal is, effective final growth. So why do I formulate some of the blends that I do? For example, I'll give you another example. I have a blend that's a very shady blend called Inner Sanctum, and of course I got triticale in there for a nurse crop. That concept is it looks like a lot, but the total volume in that, in the bag says 45%. When you plant it, it explodes, and so it looks like a lot, but again, it's only 9, 10, 11% of that final stand, depending on what seeding rate you use. And then we have a brassica, Giro brassica nurse crop in there that, even though we're less than 20% of a final stand, it really explodes on the ground. It looks like a lot. It's also multi-graze. It also gives some exposure to deer in areas that they're not as used to brassicas, and this being more attractive brassica. And then you got the annual clovers that grow at a faster rate than the perennial clovers. These annual clovers are really attractive, highly desirable, tolerate the heat better than some clovers like ladinos. They actually are way more cold tolerant, staying green below the snow. When we have snow, they stay green below 0, 10 below, 15 below 0. And yet we also put in those blends the ladinos and the medium reds and the outside clovers. So again, that window, when you look at each of those forages in a blend, and I'm not going to get into all that today, but we got some of that early April, May attraction. We have some of these forages in there that can tolerate these June, July, August months. Excuse me. Then we also have forages in there. They're going to be really attractive into the fall hunting season, and as well late into the fall during the winter because of their cold tolerance. So cold tolerance, heat tolerance, drought tolerance, handles grazing pressure, fast snapback. And so that's also a consideration too. I always want to have forages that are more multi-graze. They can tolerate heavy grazing pressures. Forages like Balanced Fixation Clover I tested numerous times before I offered it to my client base, even as much as running a lawnmower across your land. Mowing it short, trying to stud it out, trying to see how fast of snapback you can be. Creating an environment like where you have high deer pressures, where they might mow your plots to the ground. And then lastly, a topic I don't discuss a lot. I'm a nutritionist first and foremost. Started in 1991 working with high-end farmers. I've still done that throughout my career. Doing nutrition work for some of the most successful dairy farmers, most successful deer farms, most successful free range, food plotters, and habitat managers. So from a nutritionist standpoint, there's that aspect. So many people might grasp the concepts of forages that mature slower. We're going to have a wider window of protein benefit, a wider window of energy levels that are really beneficial, a wider window of your minerals that are really important. But there's also an element of synergy that it goes back to what I've learned and what I've worked with farmers way back in the early 90s. Kind of like the TMR concepts with dairy farmers, there is that kind of thing you could be looking at for deer. And of course, there's selective browsers. There's a lot of browse they're going to consume throughout the day that can be a little more fibrous, some of which is really a benefit, and some can be a negative when it comes to fiber digestion, capturing for feedstuffs, fiber sources that stay in their system long enough. You never want to have a deer eating a diet solely of what I call rocket fuel, things that are really digestible too fast on the digestion, where they pass through the system too fast, whether it be just the fiber aspect or even low, it could be low fiber, super high protein, super high energy, super high minerals, but it doesn't stay in the deer very long. It passes through. So that's why in some blends, again, we want to have a blend of forages that mature at different rates, because even if they're selectively browsing, sometimes they're still eating elements in some of these same forages. You could have 5 forages in a blend, and they're not just one day picking out all of one forage, the next day all of another, 5 days later all of another. They can be mob grazing in some cases. So the rate of passage varies from forage to forage. For example, alfalfa will have a different rate of solubility, protein solubility, which we're not going to cover too much here, than your medium red clovers, for example. Some forages tend to be more bound protein than others, which means bound protein means it's there, but it moves through the animal and they don't get the use out of it, or as much of the use out of it. Some forages can be decent in fiber, and fiber generally is the benefit with a ruminant, but some forages tend to be high in lignin. Lignin being what helps any plant stand and maintain standability. The higher the lignin, the better it stands. The higher the lignin, the less digestible it could be. So I'm not going to get into all these forages that I sell, but there's a reason for some of that too. I want to have staggered maturity, biodiverse genetics, but I'm also trying to not just put things that have the same things being forages, that have a very similar nutrient breakdown rate of passage. I'd like to stagger my rates of passages. I like to have different sources of fiber. I like to have different sources of protein, different rates of energy diversity. And so you get that. For example, things like my grains and greens. These grain, depending on what stage they're in maturity, are way more bypass, way less soluble, The fiber's still fairly digestible until it goes into reproduction. And then you might have some of these slower growing brassicas like the Giro brassica in there that's really soluble. It's kind of like rocket fuel. They eat it and it can move through the system too fast. So we actually got faster growing initially, but when we get out to day 28 or 30 or so on these grains, and we got day 20 or 30 where that Giro forage brassica is still rocket fuel. So when they consume some of each of those forages, the grains kind of help slow things down in the system and work in unison where we don't have loss, where we don't have nutrition loss because the deer eating forages that are just all like candy and moving through their system too fast. And yes, I have seen that in my career. Once upon a time on the Grand Prairie farm, there's a buck fawn that just loved the brassica blends. And obviously his diet was predominantly brassicas because every time I seen him out there, he looked really loose. His manure was loose. It was hanging wet and matted below his tail head. And those are the kind of things that can happen. And so again, that's why I would not say don't ever plant pure brassica blends, but that's the reason why I also have a brassica blend that has the annual clovers in there. That's why I try to steer more and more people towards my grains and greens that has a higher percentage of grain in that blend. And again, that's why I also like to have people plant strips where they have on the edges your perennial clover type blends, your perennial legume blends. In some cases, they could have annuals with it. And then having a strip that could be flex acres, could it be beans, could it be one variety of brassica blend. And then next to it, if you have a wide enough area where you could have even a third strip that could be a little more cold tolerant, more late season focus if it's a fall focused brassica grain type blend. Because then deer will teach you so much. Deer will eat what they need to eat when they need to eat it. They're really tuned in with because their sense of smell and also taste and they understand that there's some medicinal benefits of some of the forbs and browse that they eat. And again, there's also forages that we can formulate that have gut health benefits. That's part of the reason why I love certain forages way more than the wildlife industry. But yet now we're seeing people that are paying attention to what I'm doing, that they're starting to include more forbs in their formulations, whether they understand the true why of those. It probably doesn't really matter. But again, there's a big why effect when it comes to using chicory. There's a big why effect when it comes to using some other forbs. And there's also a why effect why I really, really like having pollinator diverse bedding sources versus these pure grass, especially on the switch grass end of things, because the deer being selective browsers and some of these pollinators besides the birds and the bees and those other benefits. There's some other benefits when it comes to browsing those when there's certain times that deer maybe either get a little more challenged because of drought or during the extreme weather conditions that some people have in the winter. So anyway, this is about a half an hour seminar, just kind of explaining some basic concepts a little bit here. As always, people are welcome to reach out to me with questions, and we'll try to get you a little bit more answered. If people ever want a little bit more detailed summary, there's way more details in the why. Every single blend, every single forage has a why. Has a why at that rate, has a why in that blend. And that's my challenge for people, is challenge people out here that are selling products. Okay, why? Explain this blend to me. How did you formulate the way it is? What does it accomplish now? But also why and what does it accomplish in the future? Every forage tilts the table in your favor for having success or decreases the abilities to having success the next year when you're planting the current year. Thanks much. Hopefully this helped.